Now we see that support for Bradley Manning there, and of course the other main character in this WikiLeaks saga is Julian Assange. And not too long ago it seemed that American journalists were on his side. After all, they benefited from these leaks by being able to write hundreds of stories about the documents. But now it looks like Assange is on his own. So why the shift? Well, for more, Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, Joel Simon, is talking to us from New York. Joel, good to see you there. So, part of this back and forth here is whether or not Assange is a journalist. In your view, is he a journalist, and should he then expect to have those same rights that members of the press here have?
Well, our vantage point on this is that while it's an important and interesting debate that's taking place among journalists and media organizations about whether Julian Assange is a journalist, from the vantage point of press freedom and the defense of press freedom in the United States, it really doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Our concern is that if Julian Assange is prosecuted in the United States under the Espionage Act for the dissemination of classified information, that will have an impact on journalists in this country and potentially on press freedom around the world.
Now, your group actually wrote a letter to Attorney General Eric Holder urging him not to prosecute Assange, warning that it could have a chilling effect around the world. Talk a little bit more about what was in that letter, and have you heard back from Mr. Holder?
We haven't yet heard back, but basically our argument is, as I stated, the First Amendment of the Constitution guarantees press freedom in the United States. And the Espionage Act has never been a successful prosecution of a journalist or anyone for disseminating information. And so the notion that somebody could be prosecuted for disseminating information under the Espionage Act, in our view, would open the door for subsequent prosecutions potentially of journalists and weaken the protection that journalists in this country currently enjoy.
And it's interesting because the other part of the debate here is a lot of folks are asking whether or not American journalists took a pass, meaning, they're not really talking about Assange's right or speaking out about the possibility that he could be charged with a crime. But again, a lot of these publications benefited from Assange giving them these documents in terms of, how many stories they had, how much other media attention they had. What do you make of that?
Well, look, Julian Assange is a very polarizing figure, and people have very strong feelings about him and WikiLeaks, and that's true across the profession. I'm part of this profession, and I've listened to the debates, and I've listened to the impassioned arguments, but our point is really simple. It really doesn't matter where you come down in that debate, whether you think Julian Assange is a journalist or not. If he is successfully prosecuted in this country for the dissemination of classified information, essentially there's a commonality of purpose. What WikiLeaks has done is close enough to what journalists do that if he were prosecuted, it would have an effect on journalism here. And that is why we felt it was imperative for us to speak out and to write that letter to the Attorney General.
But isn't that sort of their point? And a lot of folks have brought this up. Obviously they don't want another Julian Assange coming around anytime soon. So they're trying to do this to essentially send a kind of message that if you're going to go ahead and act the way Julian Assange has acted, this is what might happen to you.
Well, I think that's precisely right, and that's why we felt it was imperative for us to speak out, because the other interesting aspect of this potential prosecution, and we don't know what the plans are in terms of the U.S. Attorney General. We only know that a criminal investigation is ongoing. But should they decide to pursue criminal charges under the espionage, it will be applied extraterritorially, in other words, outside the United States. So potentially journalists around the world who report on or publish information about classified activities of the U.S. government might feel that they, too, could be subject to prosecution. And that's precisely why we feel it's important for us to speak out and to make our concerns known.
You mentioned the Espionage Act, and some folks would argue that, that the act itself is unconstitutional. I
mean, our focus, I understand those arguments that but our focus is much more narrow. Our focus is on the application of the Espionage Act to the press and to the act of disseminating information, which is what journalists do. So we're an organization, the Committee to Protect Journalists defends the rights of journalists around the world. We're very clear about our mandate and our purpose, and that is why we're looking at this in a fairly narrow way, and we're looking at the impact on journalists in this country and around the world.
And of course, we're going to continue to follow your organization and the case in general. Joel Simon, Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thanks so much, Joel.